Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a stained glass artist with a problem. I've been working to make my glass art a business for the last 6 years, and while I've seen a lot of growth, I'm still struggling to make it my full-time career. The thing about stained glass is that it's an extremely labor-intensive and time-consuming process. I've recently come to the realization that the only way I'll ever be able to expand my business is to start outsourcing some of this labor. While I'd love to take on an apprentice, I've spent over 2 decades honing my craft, so I really don't have the confidence that I can just introduce another person to what I'm doing. And so this is where the Wazer comes in. I'm not an engineer, I'm not even particularly technical, but I'm going to spend the next year figuring out if this it's really not little, machine can make some big changes to my art business. So let's start with the install. I had really wanted to use this video to show that I could handle this all by myself. However, the machine did arrive on its own pallet, followed by a second one with 2,200 pounds of the grit it uses. Probably a little much for me on my own, so I called in some reinforcements. My parents, father-in-law, brother-in-law, and my husband. We also took a good look at my basement workshop to figure out the best spot for the Wazer. Since it needs ample space, water, and power, the only realistic spot for it was where my laundry sink and stand-up freezer were. So those just kind of had to move. We almost quit for the day here, but my dad is a very goal-oriented guy and just started disconnecting stuff. Once that was out of the way, we moved on to installing the stand. This thing is heavy, and it's a bit more involved than I expected, but with everyone helping, we got it into position. We may have put the legs on upside down, since I don't think that shelf is looking like the right height. Oops. At that point, everyone bailed and left me to my task of figuring out the rest. But honestly, I was kind of excited to see how it would all come together. At first, I was a bit overwhelmed by the sheer number of parts. You know when you open a box and there's a mountain of pieces and you're just like, how am I supposed to figure this out? But after looking over the instructions, I realized that many of the extra parts were backups and replacements. That was a huge relief. The power hookup was simple, nothing fancy to film there, but prior to that, the water hookup gave me a bit of trouble. For some reason, every time I thought I had it right, water started leaking. I was getting a bit frustrated because it seemed to be such a simple connection, but after several attempts and finally calling my brother-in-law for backup, it turned out the very complex solution to my issue was to push harder. With that finally sorted out, I moved on to filling the machine with water, adding the grit, and following the initial cut steps in the manual. It was actually kind of fun and a little startling seeing it come to life. The first thing I made was a little bottle opener from the preloaded test files just to try it out. I was amazed at how clean and precise the cut was. Now I was ready to get some glass moving. I had completed the basic setup and felt ready to take on something a bit more complicated. But there was one more minor obstacle. Turns out the machine required a firmware update before I could dive into the full features. Now this is not particularly thrilling for the purposes of a video, but it's worth mentioning because I had to call my brother-in-law again for his micro SD converter. I swear that's the last help I needed. Once the update was done, I felt finally ready to try out my first real project. I haven't really dug into the software yet, but I felt confident that I could get my new Wazer to drill a hole for me. Well, I say drill, but I really mean cut a tiny circle. Why? Because it was the middle of holiday ornament season, and I have a bunch of these fused glass pickles to make. Yes, pickles, Christmas pickles, they're a thing, I promise. One of the worst tasks for me during this time of year is drilling the holes in these pieces. It takes forever, and I'm usually standing there at the drill press for about 3 minutes per piece, making sure not to crack the glass. And yes, I'm drilling underwater to keep the glass cool and avoid breaking it. So when I saw how fast and precise the Wazer could cut through glass, I was in awe. It took the Wazer only about 10 seconds to cut a perfect hole, and I was able to get through all of my ornaments in the time it would have taken me to drill just a single one by hand. I can't tell you how much time and frustration that saved me. This machine has a ton of potential for changing how I work. I'm already feeling more confident about scaling up and definitely experimenting with more complex designs. The Wazer has already streamlined a process I've been doing by hand for years, and it's exciting to think about the other ways I can incorporate it into my workflow. So that's the installation and my first experience with it. I've got a lot to learn, but I think this will be a real game changer. Stick around because in the next video, I'll be diving into more complicated projects to incorporate Wazer into my glass art workflow. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on what comes next.